Imagine looking at a pristine, like incredibly high-resolution satellite image of a primary school.
Right, from way up in space.
Exactly. You can see the heavy tank treads tearing up the sports field. You can see temporary trenches dug around the perimeter. You can even see the elongated, distinct shadows of soldiers smoking by the back door in the afternoon sun.
Yeah, the detail is amazing.
It is. But what that multi-million-dollar satellite completely misses, what it's entirely blind to, are the 368 people trapped in the basement directly beneath their boots.
That's the part that really gets you.
It really does. So welcome to another custom-tailored deep dive designed specifically for you. Usually when we talk about archaeology, a very specific picture comes to mind, right? We think of ancient ruins, Egyptian tombs, or, I don't know, brushing the dust off dinosaur bones.
Yeah, we think of the distant past, like centuries or millennia ago.
Exactly. But today, we are looking at what happens when those exact same tools of archaeology are applied to an event that happened barely 3 years ago.
Which forces a complete paradigm shift in our understanding of what it means to uncover history. We stopped looking at centuries, and we were forced to start looking at days, hours, and even minutes.
Now, before we get too deep into this, the sources we're diving into today deal with the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, specifically looking at the actions of Russian and Ukrainian forces in the spring of 2022. And just to be clear up front, we are not here to take any political sides or endorse any specific viewpoints.
Right. That's really important to note.
Yeah, our mission is simply to impartially report on the factual content provided in these archaeological sources and just explore the ideas they contain.
And that distinction is crucial because the materials we are examining are deeply layered, incredibly recent, and they represent this completely new frontier in how we document contemporary events.
So we're working from a 2026 journal article published in Antiquity alongside a press release and a summary piece. They all detail the contemporary archaeology of the March 2022 Yahidne war crime in Ukraine. And the mission of this deep dive is to understand how ordinary, mass-produced objects transform into profound cultural heritage. We're going to explore how the physical traces of a recent tragedy teach us about memory, about absence, and ultimately about survival.
It's a heavy topic, but incredibly fascinating.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this. To really grasp the scale and the timeline of what happened, we have to start with that macro perspective. We have to look at what the satellites saw.
So the timeline here begins on March 3rd, 2022. This is just 7 days into the initial Russian invasion. Russian forces from the 55th Mountain Motorized Rifle Brigade enter Yahidne.
Which is the small village about 120 kilometers northeast of Kyiv, right?
Exactly. But what stands out immediately in the logistical data is the origin of this specific brigade, because they are normally based in the Tuva Republic.
Which is deep in Siberia.
Deep in Siberia. We're talking more than 4,200 kilometers away from this quiet Ukrainian village.
That's just wow.
The geographical displacement alone is staggering. You have an entire military apparatus moved across the continent and dropped into a completely foreign, rural, agricultural setting.
And the researchers, they wanted to see what this occupation actually looked like from above as it was happening.
Yeah, but getting commercial satellite imagery from that exact time and place was incredibly difficult.
Because the airspace was restricted?
Restricted, yeah, and commercial satellite tasking was heavily regulated due to the conflict. But they did manage to secure 2 specific images from Maxar Technologies.
From the Worldview 2 and Worldview 3 satellites, right? Dated March 18th and March 22nd.
Yes, and those specific satellites are capable of sub-meter resolution, meaning they can capture objects on the ground that are smaller than a meter wide.
That's insane, from hundreds of miles up in space.
Right, and the images they captured are incredibly revealing of the military footprint. You can clearly see the heavy vehicle tracks pressed deep into the fields. You see artillery craters, destroyed checkpoints, and burned out civilian vehicles.
And all the field fortifications, too.
Exactly. Temporary field fortifications and foxholes, all strategically clustered around the local primary school. The imagery leaves absolutely no doubt that the school had been commandeered and turned into a military garrison.
The resolution is so sharp, you can literally see the shadows of the Russian soldiers standing near the school's rear entrance. Looking at it is it's surreal.
It really is. It brings to mind a fascinating concept from the French philosopher Roland Barthes. He described photography as a clock for seeing.
A clock for seeing? How does that even apply to a satellite image?
Well, Barthes has argued that a photograph is essentially a mechanism that connects the present moment to something that is irreversibly past. It freezes time, right?
Yeah.
But it also measures the distance between the viewer and the event.
Oh, I get it.
The researchers in this study argue that these satellite images function in that exact same way. They are a clock for seeing this specific, fleeting military occupation. They lock the physical reality of March 2022 into a permanent visual record.
But as incredibly detailed as they are, they completely miss the most vital detail of the entire scene.
Precisely.
Because while the satellite is picking up the shadows of the soldiers on the ground, it cannot penetrate the concrete to see the 368 civilians trapped directly beneath those shadows, in the basement of that very school.
It's completely blind to them.
It's like looking at a pristine Google Earth image of a house while a hurricane is destroying it from the inside. The satellite captures the military reality perfectly, but it is totally fundamentally blind to the human reality.
The most significant thing in the frame is entirely invisible to the macro view.
Oh.
And that limitation is exactly why contemporary archaeologists can't rely solely on remote sensing. They had to go underground.
They had to descend into the microview to find the actual truth of what happened in Yahidne.
Right.
Let's follow the researchers down those stairs and into that school basement, because the numbers involved here are just staggering, and it requires a moment for you to really visualize. You have 368 civilians packed into 7 small rooms and 1 connecting corridor.
Yeah.
And the total floor space is only about 200 square meters.
To put that spatial reality into perspective for you, 200 square meters is roughly the size of a standard singles tennis court.
A tennis court.
Now imagine placing nearly 400 human beings onto that single tennis court and locking the doors.
And the demographics of the people trapped down there. I mean, there were 69 children. The youngest was an infant, just 1.5 months old. And the oldest person in the basement was 93 years old.
And they were locked in that space for 27 days.
27 days. The physical conditions described in the sources are just beyond horrific. There were no functioning toilets, no running water.
The air was incredibly damp and suffocating because of the lack of ventilation.
People were forced to sleep sitting upright on chairs or just leaning against the walls simply because there wasn't enough floor space for everyone to lie down at once. They laid pieces of scavenged cardboard over the cold concrete floor just to get some minimal insulation.
And the physical toll of that environment was devastating. Over those 27 days, 10 elderly people died from exhaustion, lack of oxygen, and an absence of medical care.
Just awful.
And initially, the occupying soldiers did not allow the bodies to be removed from the basement.
Wait, really?
Yes, this meant the living, including those 69 children, were trapped in that cramped, suffocating space alongside the deceased.
That is unimaginable. And we also know from the historical record that between 17 and 19 other people were killed elsewhere in the village during this same period.
Yeah.
So when the archaeological and investigative teams finally went into that basement months and years later, the physical artifacts left scattered on the floor painted such a vivid, chaotic picture. You have the prisoners' items like crushed plastic cups, dirty, cuddly toys, school books, both Russian and Ukrainian language texts just strewn about.
And then you have this jarring, surreal contrast with the artifacts left by the Russian troops who had occupied the floors above.
Right.
The cataloging of those items reveals the dual nature of the site. The researchers found sand-filled ammunition boxes that had been used to fortify the ground floor classrooms.
In a primary school.
In a primary school. There was graffiti on the walls with hostile messages and technical diagrams of firing lines. They found crumpled copies of a special edition of the Komsomolskaya Pravda propaganda newspaper.
What did the newspapers say?
Well, the articles inside claimed a swift military victory and falsely stated that the troops were being welcomed by the local population.
Wow. Talk about a disconnect from reality.
Yeah.
And they even found large jars of pickled cucumbers and sauerkraut that the soldiers had brought with them or distributed. But the expiration dates printed on these jars were from 2012 and 2014.
Yeah, decade-old rations.
Here's where it gets really interesting and where I kind of have to pause and push back on the premise a little bit.
Yeah.
Is a jar of expired 2012 pickles or a 3-year-old newspaper actually archaeology?
I know what you mean.
Because when I hear about this, it just sounds like crime scene investigation. We have DNA being swabbed to identify perpetrators. We have forensic teams documenting evidence for tribunals. Why are the researchers insisting on calling this archaeology?
Well, what's fascinating here is that question represents the core tension of this entire field of study. You see, CSI and forensic science are primarily concerned with identifying a perpetrator and establishing the mechanics of a crime.
Right, the who and the how.
Exactly. Archaeology, on the other hand, is concerned with understanding a culture, a community, and the human experience within a specific space. The researchers address this distinction using Sigmund Freud's concept of the uncanny.
The uncanny, like when something feels creepy because it's almost normal but not quite.
Yes, Freud's original German term is unheimlich, which literally translates to unhomely. The uncanny is the strange within the familiar. It occurs when every day, safe objects are suddenly thrust into a deeply unsettling context.
Okay, that makes sense.
Think about a typical primary school. It's a place designed for safety, learning, and childhood development. That is the familiar. Now introduce a sand-filled ammo box, a decade-old jar of military rations, or a child's nursery bed dragged down into a dark, suffocating basement. Suddenly those mundane, mass-produced objects become uncanny.
The context completely rewrites what the object is.
Precisely. Archaeology isn't defined by how much dirt is piled on top of something, or how many centuries have passed. It is defined by how material culture reflects human behavior.
So these objects are transformed from mere garbage or legal evidence into profound cultural artifacts.
Yes, because they are the physical residue of a massive disruption in the ordinary flow of life. They tell us how people tried to survive, how they adapted, and how they processed an unimaginable trauma.
And nowhere is the processing of that trauma more visible than on the walls of the basement itself. The story doesn't just stay on the floor among the scattered objects, it moves vertically.
It does.
And this is where the concept of absence starts to speak louder than any physical evidence left behind.
The walls became a vital canvas for both the children and the adults. But they utilized that space in vastly different ways, reflecting two entirely different psychological survival strategies.
The kids managed to get their hands on some stray crayons, bits of paint, and pieces of charcoal, and they started drawing. And when you look at what they drew, it is so ordinary that it completely breaks your heart.
Yeah.
They drew the little astronaut characters from the video game Among Us. They drew pixelated pickaxes from Minecraft. They drew colorful flowers, butterflies, the sun, clouds.
That's what kids draw everywhere.
Exactly. In one particular room, using a dark piece of charcoal, a child drew a meteor on a collision course with a grocery store. Another kid scratched a scene of a hunter chasing a mammoth with a spear next to a wolf howling at the moon.
And alongside the drawings, they also left written inscriptions. Someone simply wrote, "Hello?" above a cluster of drawings. Another child wrote, "No exit."
Oh, man.
And one deeply moving scrawl scratched into the wall just asks, "Mommy, when will you buy me a phone?"
The researchers point out something incredible about this collection of art. The most profound thing about these children's drawings is what is completely missing from them.
The absence.
Yes. Across all the visual records left by these 69 kids, there is not a single depiction of a soldier. There are no tanks, there are no weapons, there is no violence. They completely omitted the horrific reality happening right above their heads.
The psychological mechanism at play there is fascinating. It's a form of dissociation and survival. By drawing Minecraft a game inherently about building, surviving, and imposing order on a chaotic, blocky world, they were attempting to exert control over an environment where they had absolutely none.
That makes total sense. They created their own world.
Right. And the adults, conversely, left markings that directly confronted their grim reality. They created calendars to track the passing days. There's one particularly striking calendar drawn directly onto a wooden door.
I read about that. It starts on March 4th.
Yes. As the days progress, certain numbers are underlined. The researchers don't know exactly why, perhaps to mark specific events, interrogations, or deaths. The calendar abruptly ends on March 30th, which aligns with the day the Russian forces hastily withdrew from the village.
And then, on March 31st, someone came back to that same door and wrote 3 words. "Hours have come," meaning the Ukrainian soldiers had finally arrived.
It gives you chills, and right next to that door, someone wrote a list. It is a meticulous list of the dates and the surnames of the people who died inside the basement.
Wow.
On the other side of the door, they listed the names of those killed elsewhere in the village. They could only account for 17 names at the time, reflecting how profoundly cut off they were from the outside world.
How do archaeologists even begin to categorize a calendar of the dead or a drawing of a Minecraft pickaxe in a war zone? I mean, it completely defies traditional museum classification.
It does. The researchers synthesized the weight of these markings using a concept from the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, known as hauntology, and specifically his idea of the specter, which he explored in his book, Spectres of Marks.
Okay, let's break down hauntology for a second, because my mind immediately goes to ghosts haunting an old house.
It's not about literal ghosts floating in white sheets. In this philosophical context, a specter is a material trace of unresolved trauma. It represents lost futures and past that refuse to simply disappear.
So it's about time being out of joint.
Exactly. Derrida argued that our understanding of time isn't just a clean, straight line moving forward. When a massive trauma occurs, when mourning is violently interrupted, when justice hasn't arrived, the past doesn't stay neatly in the past. It haunts the present.
It disrupts the timeline. The
Yeah.
people in that basement, especially the infants, had their futures violently stolen or altered.
Yes, those artifacts, the door calendar tracking the dead, the children's desperate attempts at normalcy, they are specters. They force anyone standing in that room today to confront an unmourned past. They demand that the absence of those who died and the stolen childhoods of those who survived be acknowledged by the present.
It's almost like the basement is a haunting in reverse. The children's drawings aren't ghosts from the past coming forward to disrupt the present. Instead, they are a psychological bubble, a selective time capsule where the kids completely edited out the monsters upstairs.
That's a great way to put it.
They forced a normal, innocent childhood future into a dark space where it had no right to exist. And now, that innocent art haunts us precisely because of the horrific context it sits in.
The mundane charcoal marks become conduits for the specter. And because these physical traces are so incredibly powerful, but simultaneously so physically fragile, I mean, we're talking about smudged charcoal on a damp basement wall or a deteriorating piece of cardboard on a concrete floor, the community and the researchers were immediately faced with a massive problem.
Right, how do you preserve a site of fresh atrocity and turn it into permanent cultural heritage before it simply crumbles away? After Yahidne was liberated on March 31st, the local community made a definitive collective decision. That school building will never, ever be used as a school again. The physical structure is still standing, but its purpose in the minds of the residents has been irrevocably transformed.
Today, there is a memorial standing near the back doors of the basement. It simply reads, 27 days. And on the door itself, the words, warning, children, which were painted in red during the occupation in a desperate plea to stop the shelling, are still visible.
And there are active plans currently underway to turn the entire building into a permanent museum, to stand as a testimony to the world about what happened. But this process hasn't been entirely smooth sailing, has it?
No, not at all. When a sleek architectural concept was initially proposed by outside agencies, the local residents actually pushed back.
Good for them.
Yeah, they're insisting on having an active leading role in the design and in how their own trauma is presented to the public.
It is their lived experience, so their demand for agency is completely understandable. But building a museum requires repairing the structure. The school took direct rocket hits. The roof is damaged.
And renovations, by their very nature, require cleaning, reinforcing walls, and moving debris. Doing that will inevitably alter or even completely erase some of these fragile physical traces.
The paradox is agonizing. How do you fix a rocket hole in the roof to make the building structurally safe for visitors without a construction crew accidentally destroying the fragile charcoal drawing of a meteor on the wall below?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where the advanced tools of modern digital archaeology come to the rescue.
Okay.
Between late 2023 and early 2025, specialized Polish and Ukrainian teams, including experts from the National Institute of Cultural Heritage of Poland, came in to digitally preserve the entire site.
That's incredible.
They use technologies like LiDAR scanning and high-resolution photogrammetry.
Let's explain how LiDAR actually captures a space like this, because it's fascinating technology.
So LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. The equipment shoots millions of laser pulses out into the room every single second.
Millions. Every second.
Millions. It measures the exact amount of time it takes for each laser pulse to hit a surface and bounce back to the sensor. By calculating that time, it creates a millimeter-perfect 3D point cloud of the entire environment.
So it captures every little bump and scratch.
Exactly. It captures the exact depth of a scratch on a wooden door or the texture of the crumbling plaster. And then they combine this with photogrammetry.
Which is the photos, right?
Right, which involves taking thousands of overlapping high-resolution photographs and computationally stitching them together to create a perfect color texture over that 3D mesh.
They essentially built a perfect digital twin of the crime scene, a digital simulacrum.
The creation of that simulacrum means that even if a wall needs to be physically reinforced with steel or painted over to make the building structurally safe, the exact spatial and visual reality of that basement as it was left in March 2022 is permanently frozen in digital amber.
That is so important.
It is. Those highly accurate digital records will serve as the unalterable foundation for the future museum exhibition, ensuring the story remains completely faithful to the original scene.
When we pull back and look at the bigger picture of this entire study, well, not dot dot dot, but just thinking about it, what does this tell us about what archaeology actually is today? Because scanning a basement with lasers a year after an event feels a long way from digging up pottery shards in a trench.
It really highlights the deeply social and ethical role of contemporary archaeology. The discipline is no longer just about digging things up to place them behind glass cases for aesthetic appreciation.
Right, it's not just Indiana Jones.
No, not at all. In cases like Yahidne, archaeology is an active tool for bearing witness. It is a method of acknowledging a severe injustice, giving the survivors a permanent voice through the careful, objective documentation of their experience, and fighting back against historical amnesia.
It proves that archaeology can be deployed to process collective trauma in real time. So, what does this all mean for you, listening right now? I think it shows us that heritage isn't just some abstract, dusty concept handed down to us by ancient civilizations, set in stone thousands of years ago.
Heritage is something we are actively constructing, right now, every single day.
Yes. When tragedies happen, communities are forced to make incredibly difficult active choices. They have to find a way to balance cleaning up the debris and rebuilding their lives with preserving the painful scars of history so the world doesn't have the luxury of forgetting.
The study forces us to constantly ask what we choose to remember, and just as importantly, the mechanisms by which we choose to remember it.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started from space, looking at blind satellites that could spot a temporary trench but couldn't see the 368 people trapped underground.
We descended into that incredibly uncanny basement.
Looking at expired jars of pickles and the heartbreaking absence of violence in children's wall drawings. We talked about wooden door calendars that meticulously tracked the dead, and the digital lasers firing millions of pulses a second to preserve those historical specters before they fade away. I want to thank you for coming along on such a heavy but incredibly important deep dive today.
The material is undoubtedly heavy, but understanding these modern processes of memory, survival, and preservation is vital to understanding our current world.
It absolutely is. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a lingering thought to ponder on your own. Take a moment to look around the room you're in right now.
Yeah, look at your everyday objects.
Look at the phone sitting on your desk, the coffee cup you're drinking from, the calendar hanging on your wall, or the jacket thrown over the back of a chair. If the unimaginable happened tomorrow, what story would your mundane objects tell an archaeologist 3 years from now? What specters are we leaving behind?